get started in just a few minutes, give everybody a chance to log in and get settled. Make sure you throw your name in the chat, where you're from and where you work, so we know who's here. But you're in for a special treat today. We've got two incredible panelists. It is going to be an excellent episode. You're really going to enjoy it. And again, thank you for being here. We know there's a lot of choices when it comes to education, and we're grateful you chose us. Unless, of course, you're forced to watch this at work. But thanks for being here anyway. So give about one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and introduce our incredible panelists and get started. Again, thanks for being here. Welcome, everybody. Excellent. Thanks for being here. All right, at 11:01, we'll start. Oh, Pacific time. All right.
Normal time, 2 o'clock.
Yeah, there you go. And Luke, 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. That's right.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. For those that have attended previous episodes, this is the Real versus Feel webinar series from ASF, and it's all about making good decisions and utilizing data and feedback and metrics to run your organizations more successfully. Oftentimes we feel like something's a good idea, but then when you actually look at the data and all the information that you have, you realize maybe feel's not the best way to go about things. So I always tell people, 90% of your decision-making should be based on real, on data and analytics, and then use your gut feel at the end of it to finalize decision-making. So this is the 4th episode, so sort of a wrap-up accumulation of the other episodes, and it's using real to take action. So I'll introduce our panelists in a second, but I did want to say that the Real versus Feel webinar is sponsored by ASF, the fitness industry's preferred club management solution. With ASF, you can easily gather the data you need to know what is real and what's feel, then apply it and create the ultimate member and staff experience. And that's only the beginning. Head over to asfpaymentsolutions.com to learn more about how their newest software tools will empower you to drive revenue and scale your business with confidence. That's all true and accurate, but I will personally say thank you to ASF for caring enough about the industry, in addition to providing great products and service, to provide education, because that's what we need. So much appreciated, ASF. So let's get right to it. Let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Luke Carlson, the CEO of Discover Strength. What you may not know about Luke is that he's run so many marathons that he can't remember the specific number, but it's somewhere around 17 or 18, which makes me think a little bit that maybe the Discover Strength thing is not real and it should be Discover Cardio, but that's something Luke can tell us more about. So Luke, why don't you give us a little more about your background?
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. And it's an honor to be able to have a discussion with Adrian, who I have so much respect for. So Discover Strength launched in 2006. This past Sunday, we just kind of celebrated our 16-year anniversary. We're a studio concept. Studio is about 2,000 square feet. We focus on strength training. We have 6 corporate locations. I have a 7th that's being built in Scottsdale right now. We have 2 franchise locations that are open, and we have 2 that are being built in Minnesota. So a mix of locations that we own and operate, and then we've started franchising about a year ago.
Thank you, Luke. Thanks for the background. And I got to tell you that I've known Luke for a million years. We kind of entered this space around he had a little head start on me, but truly one of the best speakers. If you go to live events, if you're headed to IRSA in Miami, you've got to check out his sessions. It's absolutely incredible. Adrian is Antigua, is from Gainesville Health and Fitness. He's the general manager. And while Luke ran all those marathons, Adrian's a little better because he runs marathons, rides bikes, and swims. So he's completed 2 full Ironman. I officially feel like the least fit person on this call now. So thank you for that, guys. But Adrian, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I'm Adrian Antigua from Gainesville, Florida. So I've been with Gainesville Health and Fitness now for about 17 years, 17 and a half years. I'm just looking at the calendar on my computer here. Served all the different roles in the company. Started as a frontline employee, eventually worked my way up to becoming the general manager of all our clubs. So do a little bit of everything for Joe here, and under his tutelage for quite a long time. In addition to that, I'm also an area developer for a franchise called Kid Strong. That's been a recent venture between me and my wife. We've been doing that since 2020. We have 1 location open currently, and we have several in the progress in the Jacksonville area as well. So looking to expand on that venture in quite a bit of time too.
Awesome. And I've seen Adrian on panels and speak and webinars, and he's the guy that you listen to and you're looking at your colleagues going, this guy knows exactly what he's talking about and is probably really good at what he does. And he is, in fact. So what's going to be really unique about today's topic is you've got a studio model, and then you've got Gainesville, which is a massive, beautiful, incredible, one of the best facilities in the country. So you got the massive scale. Then you've also got a target market of kids in a franchise opportunity. And then Luke also with going from corporate owned to now franchising as well. So the breadth of knowledge that's going to come from our panelists is just absolutely incredible. So I'm really excited. So again, feel versus real. And when we talk about gathering data, it could be from surveys, from feedback, industry trends. Ursa does a lot of great reporting on what's going on in the industry and what's trending up, what's trending down. So we're just talking about feedback and data and statistics and analytics in general, and using that all again to be real about our decisions as opposed to just guessing and hoping things work out. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So we'll jump right into question one, and we'll go ahead and start with Adrian. But tell me ways that data is integral to your decision-making process.
There's just a couple of ways to answer this. I'm a data-driven person. I like to view a lot of different data sets and analyze them multiple different ways to get an insight as to what I mean by that. If you were to open my laptop and see all the tabs that are open on my web browser, there's about 30 tabs open at a time. And that's just the way my brain processes things, right? But really for me, it's the more information I can, assess about a situation, it just helps me to get a better background of what's actually occurring. It's not just one perspective on something, but what are the different ways to analyze something so you see it in both all the different avenues in which you can address it. But the way that you make those decisions on those is based off of how do you analyze and what's the most important data set from all of that altogether. So it's kind of it's a broad question because there's so many different ways that can come into that. But I'm sure as we get deeper into the conversation here, I can dive much more into how we process which data sets to look into, how to kind of spend more time on one over the other, and how that process works for us.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a little bit about prioritizing, right? Because there is an endless amount. How do you figure out what matters most? How about you, Luke?
So I think that the starting point is we can get lost in too much data. In 2022, there's so much data, and the key in using it in your business is how do you work through the data and understand what's noise and what actually is providing direction. So when we think about it in our business, we always think about, well, what are we trying to accomplish? So the filter is, well, let's start off. It might be big picture vision of the organization, but the vision might be, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Okay, so we start to think about it. We start to understand, where are we trying to go? What are we trying to create? What are we trying to accomplish? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Then we say, how can we turn to data to help us make this decision? Then we analyze that data. So we're not just looking at all of the data, we're looking at data that's going to help us solve this problem. And then when we understand the findings of the data and we've tried to separate out the noise, then we can take those findings and we can pass it through the filter again of the vision. Is this even what we were interested in the first place? So for me, it's vision, then data, and then vision, and then we move to an actual decision. But the key is you got to know what you're trying to accomplish. You have to know what you're trying to answer before you can just start looking at the data. I wouldn't be good at just looking at mass amounts of data and saying, hey, what direction should we go from all of this data? I think a lot of it becomes noise.
It's interesting to your point. This past week, I was at the Climbing Wall Summit. So it's sort of the Ursa event for the climbing wall industry. And I moderated some lightning talks and a what they call the solution room on mission, vision, values. And it's interesting that you bring that up. And I think far too often we lose track of that. And I just think that's a really significant point. Is it all goes back to what are my mission, vision, values, and does the data support it, or is it just noise? I think the second piece that's interesting, and there's a conversation I had with Dr. Paul Bedford, the retention guru, figuring out what data really doesn't matter. He was talking about people brag about average membership length. And he's like, but that's because you have 10 people who love you who have been a member for 50 years while everyone else is quitting. So we think, oh, we must be doing well because of that. So, I think filtering through and figure out what is noise and what is not. Adrian, I got to tell you, man, I can have 2 tabs max open or I just lose it. I don't know how you hit my business partner, Marissa Hoff, can do that. Like 50 tabs. I just lose it. Like I have to have a clean desktop and I can't manage it.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's just I guess it's kind of like a little bit of ADHD or ADD that I have, where I just constantly just swap through each of those things. It's kind of like why I have a massive monitor, just because I have to have not just all the tabs, but I also have to have multiple screens on top of that too. So I guess it's just the way I process information all at once.
Awesome. So let's move on to the next question. When was a time you were surprised by the data? So just in general, and there may be a couple examples you want to share. I will tell you that we years ago at our last club, we're making the difficult decision to close childcare. And what we did was we did all the data and research behind it, and all the data made, because it feel horrible. I mean, the kids are cute and they have a good time. But when we did all the data, for every reason, which I explained on a previous episode, it made sense to do. But we were blown away when we did the research, and only 2% were regular users of our entire membership base.
Wow.
So it also helped cement the decision, right? Because we still felt bad for the 2%, but at the same time, we were making the 98% happy by opening up the space for other activities. So was there a time, we'll start with you, Luke, on this one, where you were just blown away or stunned?
I'm going to give 2 examples, and one is a little bit more macro, and the second's micro. So when we look at locations for our corporate stores or for franchise locations, we now use an analytics tool called Buxton. And Buxton is utilized by, I think, every big franchise company and so many retailers. And the idea of Buxton is they can take a look at your current customer data and the customer that's the people that are similar to your customer, and they can look at literally cell phone data is what they use. And they understand, for us, the Discover Strength customer, when they are in Whole Foods, are they in Whole Foods for 20 minutes or 30 minutes? Are they more likely to go to Starbucks before or after? Will they stop at Lululemon or Athleta? Like, we know, so will they drive 12 minutes or 16 minutes to get to that Whole Foods? So a combination of cell phone data, our current customer profiles, and what our competition is, what our synergistic businesses are, we can drop a pin and understand this is exactly where Discover Strength location should be. We can also look at all of our current locations and say, hey, what's the score on this location? Is it actually a good location? And so we have this mapped out across the country in the different markets that we want to develop. And to get to your question, we were utterly shocked when we thought, hey, this is a great market. Everyone told us you need to be here. Oh, you would kick butt here. You got to open a Discover Strength here. And my response was always, yes, that's a perfect spot. Our target market is totally there. That's where we need to be. And then we run the Buxton analysis, and we spend all of this money to build it out. And we find out, my goodness, we should not open there, right? And then our current locations, we would tell stories to ourselves about, why is this location so successful? Why is this location just moderately successful? And a lot of conjecture there, right? And then we would look at the data after we've run the data and say, oh no, the reason this location is successful is our target market lives right here. Mm-hmm. And I think about our original location that I'm romantic about, that we opened 16 years ago. That's a wonderful location. And for 15 years, I told people it is not a great location, but we make a ton of money at that location. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, because we're great at running the business. And then we do the Buxton data analysis and we find out, oh, this is actually a great location. And we just got lucky that our first location happened to be good demographics. So utilizing the Buxton data to tell us where should a location be and are our current locations in the right spot has been incredibly surprising to us and has absolutely contributed to how we build out strategy for growing all of our locations. So that's number one. And then number two is, this is so simple, but when I look at data on our scorecard, right, our KPIs, mm-hmm. and I look at revenue generated from our other non-core business. So our core business is one-on-one and small group strength training workouts. But we also have a bod pod, and we sell shakes, and we do just a couple other things, not much, but a couple other things. I have so many friends and colleagues and people in the industry that always call me and ask me about those other things and how much money you're making. And, oh, the reason you're doing well is because you have those other things. And we look at our scorecard, we look at our KPIs, and we say, we're making pennies on these other areas. I mean, 98% of the revenue is on the core business. So how does that inform us? When we're in a discussion as a leadership team, if we're spending too much time on those areas where they're just not fruitful, we're just not making much money, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, I say, guys, if we spend another 30 minutes talking about this, it's a disservice to the whole business because this is a tiny percentage of our overall revenue. So that I know is such an obvious example, but I want to make sure that my team, that we are not spending time talking about the things that we're just not making money on. And when I say making money, I mean revenue, and I also mean profitable revenue. We want to pour ourselves into the revenue streams that are truly profitable.
Yeah, it makes sense. What's interesting too, when you talk about the location, and by the way, for the listeners, feel is powerful. So sometimes it's hard, even when you've got the data and the statistics and the research and all that, sometimes you're still so pulled because it's emotional to do something, especially with a location. And I don't remember if it was Outliers or Freakonomics, but it was one of those books that we were talking about this pre-call, where there's a restaurant and every 6 months it's a new restaurant. And at what point, because every chef, because they're emotionally attached, thinks, but I'm a better cook and I have a better concept. And while some are better than others, like Luke, to your point, some operators are better than others, and that does make a difference. If that location doesn't make sense based on Buxton, then it's not a good location, right? So that restaurant keeps going out and everybody thinks it's going to be different. I'm going to be different. Well, the data doesn't lie. So I thought that was a really interesting point. And then again, like you said, focusing on what really matters, even if something feels good.
And what you said, Chris, I want to emphasize what you said. If you have any part of you that's truly entrepreneurial, right? You are excited about the feel part. And sometimes our ego gets attached to, no, I see around corners and I know things that are going to happen before they happen. And I spot the trends, and every part of my entrepreneurial fabric tells me this is what we need to do. And that becomes a little bit a part of our identity. And maybe, I mean, I think to a large degree allows us to be successful early on. We just need to know, as we grow and mature and our companies grow and mature, how do we start appropriately using the data to inform those decisions and either reinforce those entrepreneurial hunches or convictions, or in fact, tell us, no, you're wrong. And I will use the example of one of my favorite entrepreneurs, Sam Walton. Sam Walton, it was said about Sam Walton, one of his presidents said about this, there's two qualities that make Sam Walton a superhuman. Number one, the man woke up every morning hell-bent on making something better, okay? And number two, and this is the one that it really speaks to our point, is if he was convicted about something, and he got new information, new data, new evidence that he was wrong, he had absolutely no problem completely abandoning that idea and taking a turn 180 degrees the other direction and moving forward. His ego was not attached to that idea. His ego was attached to, how do we move forward and make this better? And that is hard to do. We've all worked with leaders and we've all worked with entrepreneurs who struggle to do just that.
Yeah, and that goes back to your point about vision. He was keen on his vision. So it wasn't about the momentary thing. It was about, the bigger picture. And does this work for the vision? If not, forget it, move on, try something else. Awesome. Adrian, what do you got for us?
I couldn't agree more in regards to locations. I mean, with Kid Strong, it's the same exact thing. It's about, what's the location? What are the demographics of that location? How many kids are in that specific area? What are the families in there? What's the average income? All those things play such a large role into painting a picture of how well you're going to do moving forward. There's enough Kid Strong locations now to where we do, even myself, I mean, there's a HQ team that helps us to make those decisions for us as well. But it's something I'm constantly having conversations with those other area developers. Hey, what were the demos of this space? What did you open with? What did you learn from your experience? All those things. What would you do differently as far as how did you try things differently on those demographics? Very similar to what Luke said. And there's different programs out there. Buxton is a huge one, but there's other ones out there that are fantastic. Other companies that do similar things with demographic reports. So that's something we pay very, very close attention to as we look to expand in our different areas as well. Maybe something a little bit more operational, because I think, try to give something a little more relation to as far as an operational sense of something that surprised us was, yes, I look at 40 billion tabs on my computer, but then I really kind of dial into what are the most important things that drive, what drives the business forward. So like for here, Gainesville Health Fitness, membership sales is a strong driver for us.
Mhm.
And, you can look at so many different things from, how well are people closing their conversions, how many walk-ins we're getting. And so when I first kind of came on the position, I was evaluating all of those. And really what I kind of thought about was, how fast are people just getting responded to? And so that was one of the first things we really dove into was submit a web lead to your website, and how quickly are you going to get a response from that web lead. And so for us, when we first did that test, the average amount of time it took for somebody to get responded back to was roughly about 4 days, which is rough. I'm sure everybody knows now, like there's an ideal window of about 6 minutes when somebody submits that lead to when you should be in touch with them, to make sure you're capturing them there when they're most interested, after submitting your information on the website. So it was digging in. Why is it taking so long for somebody to get responded to? What processes do we need to change to make sure that they're responded to quickly? What automations can we set up so at least they get something from us right away? What automations can we set up to our sales team so that way they get notified right away? And all the decisions were basically made at that point on how do we cut 4 days down to 6 minutes. So that was one of the big aspects of that. But now over time, there's also an aspect where you have to go back and constantly re-review that process. So maybe a larger aspect of me getting surprised by this was I was dead sold and dead set that our conversion time on a lead was going to be within 10 minutes for us. Although recently, as last week, I did a test it, and of course, my automation aspects was instant, but the phone call took a day and a half, which frustrated the heck out of me. So it's that constant revision though of, okay, now you've set it up in place, you've made those decisions operationally. Now what's the revision of making sure that they're constantly being done the way that it was intended? Because you start working on 15 billion things and you don't go back to the core thing that's really making that big difference right off the bat.
I love that. And two, I think everything you shared, especially as a tactical sales operational process, you can then, it's much easier to coach your team. Be like, hey, here's what the data says. It's not your opinion as a leader. I think it should be this way. Hey team, here's the data. Here's what we've discovered. And this is why we're going to do it this way. And you're going to get better results.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. It's providing that information, not just like, oh, it's hypothetical of, you guys, how long are you getting back, or what are the results of, when you get responded back to quickly, but here's the actual proof to make sure I can help you to become successful as a salesperson or whatever it is that decision is going to be on.
That's excellent. You made me think of something. This was a significant amount of time ago, but our sales team was really struggling with booking telephone inquiries to appointments. And we had this meeting and they're like, hey, everybody just calls and they're asking for prices. They're just asking, because this is back in the day when pricing wasn't as transparent and your goal was to talk them through the process and get them to book an appointment. So the team was talking about everybody calls they're just asking for appointment, or they're asking for pricing. You don't understand this. So we recorded calls for a month just to see. And there was probably 5% of people that were just like, no, I just want prices. There were actually calls, and so some of as you guys are panelists and you guys are great at what you do and you're sharing a lot of successes, but sometimes, we share things where we just totally caught ourselves falling short and we're like, hey, learn from this mistake. But after recording the calls, we actually had people who were like, so do I just come in? Or I'm like, these people are, but the team in their mind, because it's a little, especially with emotion, negative emotions are so much stronger, right? So if one person calls that day and says, I just want pricing, man, then you're like, everybody just wants pricing, even though it's not real, it's just feel. But it was one of those where I was just stunned. I was like, wow, 5% of people just demanded pricing. The other all they wanted you to do was ask. Some asked you for an appointment, right? So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, kind of following up what Luke was saying to this answer, his answer on this question was, I think there is going to be a key set of data for every single aspect of the company, whether it's in the sales arena, whether it's finding additional locations, whether it's how well your personal trainers are converting or how long you're keeping them. Each group is going to have a specific key set of information. I like to have it at no more than 3 for each one, just because, you know, although again, I work in big numbers and multiple pages, so on and so forth, I like to focus on the key 3 for whatever that's going to be. And just like to your point, that's what makes the difference at the end. You know, it's how many conversions, how many people you talk to, did you get them in the door, or whatever else it may be, and really kind of focusing on those key indicators and move forward.
Well, it's interesting too. You mentioned 3 key ones, because that really leads us right into our next question. I mean, there's millions of ways to gather data for you to, you know, get feedback and gather data, plus all the data that's provided from other organizations like URSA, you know. So since there's a million ways and you could spend all day pulling reports, which you said you actually do, is there such thing as too much? And you kind of hit on that with, you know, yes, there's a ton. So we picked 3 keys for each role, but is there, you know, what is too much?
Yeah, I think too much is just when you can't focus anymore, right? And so I say 3, but and the way we determine those 3 for us is actually I give guidance on what 3 want it to be, but for each of our programs, I let those program directors come up with what are those 3 for them, right? So what's motivating them, what's driving them, and have them come up with what are their key 3 indicators. And then, but every now and then I have to kind of guide them into, okay, this one's a little bit more important than this one over here. And then have them set the parameters for those items as well too. And then amongst those, then we'll kind of each week I meet with my directors or my leadership team or my managers. And then we'll always have a conversation of how are those 3 things doing, and then even key it down even further to say, okay, for this week, your focus is just one thing. So you do have these 3 key drivers, but what is the one thing that moves you forward? I like focusing on one thing, single steps at a time. So that way all the energy is driven towards that to make sure we're making the proper inroads towards moving to the next step on whatever it is that we're working on.
So, you know, things change. And like you said, some people will focus just on one and that sort of thing. Do you have any examples? And this isn't putting you on the spot because it's not a previous question, but where you were tracking something or using a certain piece of data where you're like, you know what, we're moving on from that because it's not getting the result, or maybe you needed it for a while and you're like, hey, we're up to speed here. We're going to switch, you know, what we're tracking or what data we're using.
Let me think about something that we were tracking heavily and we moved away from. Yeah, I think a good one would be actually very recently with COVID. Since we reopened with COVID, a number that I was tracking very, very heavily every single week was, okay, what's our percentage of traffic penetration from, you know, this date compared to the same date the previous year. And we would look at that every single day, and we'll see that number increase to a certain point. So for us, it started when we first reopened, it was around 40% at our clubs at Gainesville Health. Then it started creeping up, you know, and then it went down for a little bit and then it went back up again. And then it kind of hit this plateau point. And it was like, all right, well, we're reporting the same number every single week. What's the point of reporting it anymore? Because the time frames are different. What's happening in the environment is different. So you can't no longer do an exact comparison of one to the other anymore. So we finally just said, all right, we're just going to scrap that data and now just do a comparison over month. And so rather than looking over year where there's, again, no correlation of how those things were compared, it's okay, let's do a smaller time gap and just make sure we are actually having a progression month over month.
Love that. Makes sense. By the way, anecdotally, I'll never forget when you guys reopened. I watched it on Facebook Live and it was just such an awesome moment, you know, with COVID being so challenging and the shutdowns. I'll never forget that Facebook Live with all the people waiting you know, to check in and get so happy to be back in the club. It was really awesome. Yeah. And I do recommend that you follow Adrian and Gainesville on social. You'll learn a ton. They do a lot of great things. Definitely a worthwhile follow.
Adrian, how long were you guys closed for, Adrian?
It was Florida, 3 days.
About 2 months. No, 2 months. Yeah.
Was it that long in Florida? Wow. Okay. Yeah. So like middle of March to middle of May.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
So Luke, too much data. When is it too much?
Yeah. Okay. Well, my first answer to that is when the data actually is not connected or meaningful to your strategy. So sometimes when we get so into connecting with colleagues and friends and peers in a given industry, and this happens in all industries, we start to learn about the KPIs and the data that the rest of our industry is looking at. And we start to say, hey, those are important for our business. Those numbers are important for our business. Well, the reality is, if we're intentional about our strategy, the data that's important to us should be different than the rest of the industry. That's the definition of having strategy. Your KPIs, your data, or the data that you are using to make decisions should be different than the rest of the industry. And so many times we need to be aware of this. So many times we go to conferences and we even get great information from organizations like URSA, and we actually should understand how to use that appropriately. It doesn't mean we have to build the same business that everybody else has built because we're all using the same data. We have to know how to use the data to pivot. We have to know when to ignore the data and say, well, that just is not, it's not pertinent to my strategy. So I think we have too much data when we're just looking at an industry as a whole and not understanding what's our strategy and how does the data look for our strategy. So that would be like KPIs, right? Your KPI should be different. How you make money should be very different. How you spend money should be very different. So that's my first answer. Now, the second, and I know you specifically said, what happens when you have too much data? So I don't think this answers that, but I have to mention it, Chris, because you commented on it and it was just brilliant. When you saw that someone said, hey, you're not transparent with prices, I think you said, or pricing was an issue, not transparent, but pricing was an issue. Right. One person said it and you said, God, people are upset about our pricing. The leader tends to observe an issue or have one anecdotal encounter with a customer, a vendor, and then they say, God, this is the problem, and it's a big problem. Yeah. And then they say it in a meeting and the whole team realizes, oh gosh, the leader thinks this is the problem. We all better run and start working on this. And the reality is it was just one squeaky wheel and we overreacted to it. That's where we need to pause and say, I have an emotional reaction to what I'm seeing. This is not on brand. This is not what we're trying to create. But let me just take a step back, look at the data and say, do all of our customers feel this way? Do all of our staff feel this way? I often find myself getting into too deep into an issue with an employee, and I think all of our employees feel this way. We got to fix this. It's a huge cultural problem. And we dig deeper, we find out, oh, no, it's 2% of our employees, or it's literally one employee. And I think the leader is the most senior leaders are the greatest culprits of doing this, right? Because when they start yelling about something, and I don't mean literally yelling, but when they get impassioned about something, the rest of the organization pays attention and starts to take action. And sometimes we shouldn't be paying attention and taking action because we haven't paused and looked at the data. So I love that you mentioned that. So I think you have a visceral response, then you got to slow down and say, do you have any data to support this? Is this problem as big as I think it is? And then if it is, then we can take appropriate action.
You know, I think it's, I'm glad you went that direction with this, and not to get into physiology, but you know, fight or flight, we're wired to respond to negativity because that's how we stayed alive. Most things we assume it's a negative, right? And we're just wired that way as people. And I think they say it takes like 10 positive experiences to or is it 10 positive to override like one negative experience? So to your point, one bad thing happens and it's visceral and it's emotional in the moment. And you're like, we got to fix this right now. Well, do we? And I'm so glad you brought that up because we used to run a special called Your Friend, Your Rate. And when we had people join as charter members, you know, they were paying as low as $29.99 at the club. And then prices were at $69, right? So some people had just joined at $69. Then we run this special where if somebody knew somebody that was in at $29, they could get their price. It was like a 24-hour special. We always sold a ton of memberships, but the couple people that got really upset because they just joined at $69 because they joined a day before would be very vocal about that. And the sales team hated dealing with that. So we said, we got to that point in the year where we always ran that special and the team got like, oh no, this is the worst thing we ever do. And I said, well, let's do this. Let's chart every single person who complains and let's see what we sell. And sure enough, hundreds of memberships sold. And it was actually only 4 people who complained. So again, to your point of, is this a problem or is it really not a problem? But those 4 people were loud. They complained a lot. Right. Another example, and I'll share this with you guys. Luke, you don't have to group X, but with group exercise, that's always very high maintenance and difficult to deal with. But we had fans in the group X room and internally we called this situation fan wars. But for whatever reason, the people that wanted the fans off were the loudest, most vocal, complaining. So we did a survey. We surveyed all Group X participants and said fans on or off. And it was like 98% wanted fans on. But if you asked any group exercise instructor, they're like, no, nobody wants them on. Everybody wants them off. It was just that those voices were louder. So this being the fourth and final episode of this particular series, it's great that we went this road because it's just so important to remember. Is it really a problem? Is this really happening on a large scale? Or is it just a couple loud voices that you don't like dealing with because it's no fun? But is it real, or is it feel?
Yeah, there's so many examples of that where you observe it as the leader, or you hear it from a direct report that you trust, and you're almost taking on their emotion, and you say, yes, we take action on this right away, rather than pausing and saying, let's see if there is any data that can support this, and then making sure your team understands, hey, we use the data to make this decision. It's not that I'm ignoring how emotional you were about this, but this is what the data says. That was a great story, Chris.
Yeah, and it's funny. The other thing it does is empowers you to communicate with the people as well. So with Fan Wars, we just said, hey, we did a survey and 98% people want them on, therefore fans are on. So people can still be upset, but you're communicating totally transparent. This is what the data says, therefore this is the decision we'll make. Mm-hmm. So Adrian, you touched on it a little bit before, but with all the access to everything, you boil it down to 3 keys. So you sort of answered this anyway, but is there any other advice on deciding with all the options what to choose? And you guys both answered it because it's what supports the vision and the strategy, right? But did you have any other thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I think it's really just continuing on that. We can keep hitting that one on the head over and over again here, but it's really what is the strategy of your business, and what is the vision of where do you want it to be? And so we do analyze and have conversations before settling on those and saying, okay, do we want to focus on this, or this, or should it be this, or this, right? And it's what is the impact going to be if you were to change A, B, and C, or D, E, and F? Now, of those 6, how do you make sure? Let's have a discussion of those 6, which is the most important one that we're going to do. So it's just kind of going through that prioritization list. Something that I like to do something I like to do with my managers at times is say, okay, let's revisit your KPIs. We settled on these 3, but what the assignment I'll give them at times is, all right, I want you to write out what are all the most important things that you guys feel like you need to be focusing on. What are all those big key numbers that you think are the drivers to move us forward? Have them do that one week. And then the next week, after we kind of review them all, it's as a team, we'll have the other managers there with them and say, okay, now let's kind of prioritize these. Of these, which ones do you think is the most important? But let's discuss it as a team now. And now say, why is item A the most important? Why do you feel it's the most important? And state your case to the rest of the group. And then the rest of the group will then have an opportunity to kind of rebuttal that and say, okay, well, I don't think it's really item A. I think it should be item B, or I think it should be item C, should be your number 1 item. So that's kind of just the way, I guess, in which I've learned to do it, in which we incorporate more than just myself and another director. But that way we kind of have a more company feel as to making sure we're all focusing and we all are on the same page, that we're all working on the right things together when we have an agreement as to what those key numbers should be for us.
I think that's really valuable insight. Far too often, the person, in the driver's seat makes the decisions for everybody, and including like your system of including the team in setting these, while you still have the ultimate, say in the situation, because you are the leader, but you get, like you said, more buy-in. It creates a team environment, and people are going to be more motivated and feel more accountable to goals that they help set. So when you're setting it with your team going, we agree on this, right? This sounds right. Okay, cool. It just adds a higher level of accountability to hitting those metrics.
Yeah. So even though I just gave that as my answer, I'll also give the rebuttal. So then when that's also not correct, right? And so, it's starting with Kidstrong, you're building up a team from the ground up. So it's a brand new business, each time you reopen essentially. And so you're bringing on a new manager. And a lot of times, they're in the opposite of what we just discussed of coming up with it as a team. There are times where you do just as a leader just have to say, hey, listen, these are the top 3 things. You may think it's going to be A, B, C, D, and F or whatever else, but these are the top few things that I want you to be focusing on. And then as you grow that team and as you develop it, it's going to be more, bottom up versus top down. So I think it depends on your scenario, where you are in your business, where you are in the business life cycle to, how much can you have of a cohesive nature versus a non-cohesive. And that's just saying this is what you should be focusing on. And I'm sure Luke has much more to share on that with him being the franchisor.
And Luke, before you start, I do want to mention, I mentioned follow Gainesville on social because they do amazing stuff. Luke, back to your original point of everything goes back to your vision. Actually let your mission, vision, values drive your organization, which is such an important thing. But make sure you follow Discover Strength, especially on Instagram. Every single post is so accurately reflective of the brand. It's super impressive. Like everything you do is completely in line with mission, vision, values. So anyway, back to the question.
Appreciate that. Thank you for that.
No need to follow Luke personally. His personal Instagram is super boring, but the company one is just great. It's like, look, I'm running. Oh, I'm running again. Oh, I'm reading. That's it. See, gave you the snippets. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway.
That's accurate. So one thing I want to add, I love everything Adrian said. This conversation's been an exciting conversation to me. We haven't mentioned that data doesn't just mean numbers. Data can be quantitative and can be qualitative. So I just want to talk about how we utilize the qualitative data, right? So like so many companies, we use NPS. I am obsessed with NPS. I'm obsessed with NPS from like a foundational Bain standpoint. How was it originally created? I love reading all things NPS. Okay, so the idea of earned growth. Well, when we look at NPS, it's not just about the number, it's about the qualitative feedback we get. Mm-hmm. And I'm old school in that I think NPS should only be 2 questions. I do not think it should be more than that. I think it should be the 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. And then it should be, why'd you give us the score? How can we get better? And that is it. So then what you have to do on a regular basis, leaders in all levels of the organization need to read through the qualitative responses. And those responses, the positive feedback that you're getting, should connect to what the strategy is, to what the core brand messaging is, right? So NPS is not just, hey, do I love this business? The NPS qualitative feedback are what people are saying, is that actually what we've tried to intentionally create as a brand, even as a culture, because culture and brand are so connected, and as a strategy. So if we say these are our strategic anchors and we look at all of this NPS feedback, not the number, but the qualitative, and we're not hearing that I love these specific things, we're doing it wrong, right? So the qualitative data is so important to us to tell us, are we on strategy? Are we on brand? So to me, I think that's among the most important data points that we look at. And I think I tend to forget that that's data because I tend to think of data as quantitative and not qualitative, but my goodness, that qualitative guides us and reinforces our strategy as much as anything else.
Yeah, that's really important. And I will tell you, we were in a position where we needed to replace all of our treadmills and our net promoter score. We were huge on net promoter score, but we saw it slowly going down. But in the comments, we got a lot of love the facility, treadmills are broken too often, buttons aren't responsive, right? And that helped us then justify the amount of money you have to spend to replace that whole thing of treadmills. So to your point, you've got to pay attention to that as well. Another kind of funny NPS thing, and I might have mentioned it on our last webinar, but I big believer, and I would share it weekly in my all staff communications until we had a meeting with open feedback at the end of it. And they're like, if we have to hear the net promoter score one more time every single week that it went up 2 and then down 1, and we hate it. So in my mind, I was like, this is the most important metric in the world. To your point, I love it, study it and all of that. But it was really interesting that the staff was like, we get it, like once a month. We like that it's posted in the office, but we don't want to email every week telling us it went up 1, right? So feel versus real utilized. And then a totally unrelated side thing, we had one member, it was an older member, fairly grumpy, and our goal was to make every member as happy as possible. So we would sometimes have the air conditioning on and the doors open, and he would complain. He's like, that's such a waste of electricity and whatever. So we literally would see him approaching midday, run and close those doors, like every little thing to make this guy happy. And we never got him above an 8 on net promoter score. And there was even one where we had jacket hooks and little things you could put your keys in while you worked out. And he's like, there really should be a table back here so I could put my keys on it before I hang my jacket. And I'm like, or you could put your keys in the thing, hang your jacket. Like, but we did everything. And then it became an internal goal to make this guy happy. So finally, when we couldn't, I grabbed him one day and I was like, what do we have to do? We've been an 8 forever. We want you at a 10. He goes, well, if people want a pool or a basketball court, you don't have those. So I wouldn't refer them here. And the question is, how likely are you to refer someone to this facility? So I would say an 8, because there'll be people that want things that you just don't have. No, like, all right, there you go. Thank you, Net Promoter, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, Net Promoter Score is super important. Again, giving you the feel versus real and tracking that anecdotal evidence. So kind of to bring things back, Adrian, what's the best advice in regards to, and we've covered a ton of stuff. So, you know, in regards to real versus feel, what's the best advice you could give an operator, manager, owner?
Well, for me, I like going back to what's one thing, you have a discussion of all these different items. What are all the things that you can work on? What are all the different indicators, data points? But then it comes down to, again, what are the actual things you have to do with that data, and how do you move forward, how do you progress? A lot of times you have these grandiose ideas of, okay, we're going to do 15 billion things. And then for me, what I've really found to be the most successful aspect of being able to move forward and actually get things done is, what is the first step? And actually, people in my companies, they're probably annoyed by me, because that's the constant thing I press on. It's, what is step one? I don't care about all these other things that we want to do. I know that where we want to go, but what is step one for us right now? Right? And identifying step one, to me, is so key, because step one sets the path for step 2, 3, and 4. So that's probably the biggest thing piece of advice I would share to everybody, is identify what is step one. You talked about like triathlons and for Luke's marathons, right? And you think that, okay, I got to run. If you're training for a marathon, all right, I have to run 26 miles right off the bat. No, it's getting outside the door and taking the first couple steps. It's step one is putting your shoes on. That's step one. And for a lot of people, that's the hardest thing, right? And so just doing that first action, for me, is probably the most important key advice I would share. And it's not a fancy piece of advice by any means. But I think that's the most important thing I would share for anybody.
No, I think it's not fancy, but it's important. And I actually, I wrote that down, but small steps, right? Take that first step and then small steps. Sometimes whether it's a session at URSA or another event or a webinar like this, and you hear all this great info and you're like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. Where do I even start? Just pick something that matters and start there. I think that's incredible and accurate advice. And one reason, that type A people fail, and most people listening are operators, managers, owners, are type A entrepreneur type people, is they try to take on too much at once and it's overwhelming and then nothing gets done. So, small steps, figuring out that first step, I think that's an incredible piece of advice. Mr. Carlson.
Yeah. Tell me the question again. What's the advice that I would give?
Yeah. Just, in regards to, and like you've been doing this, both of you have been doing this the whole time, great advice throughout, but what's that like one piece of advice regarding, using real over feel?
Yep. I would make
maybe
sure
it's recapping something you said before.
Yeah. So I think my summary statement is, look at the qualitative and quantitative data. So this is either data, it's KPIs, it's numbers, it's a collection of the stories told to you from customers or staff. That would be qualitative. And make sure you're looking at that through a filter of the strategy and the priorities to prove out your strategy or priorities, or understand where your strategies and priorities need to be updated. That's number one. And then when you think about innovation, when you think about new ideas, rifle shots, and we've all heard the terminology rifle shot, right? You don't fire the cannon right away. You do the rifle shot first, but then rifle shot, look at data around the success or failure of the rifle shot, and then launch. So we should always have this kind of test, look at the data approach, and then grow bigger and launch on a bigger level. So that's a practical way, I think, to actually put the data to work in your innovations as you grow and evolve the business.
I love that. And it really complements what Adrian said very well, right? Figure out, start with something small, and then test it. Because the other thing is you're not going to get this right off the bat, especially if you're using KPIs and data and everything unique to you, as you mentioned before, right? So you try it, test it. If it's effective, do more of it. If it's not, figure out what you should be doing instead. So I think it's almost like you guys planned this ahead of time, the perfectly complementary advice to go together. So just as we wrap things up, and we're right on time. So Luke, the second we log off this webinar, what would be your number one thing? And I know that information is useless, action is paramount. That's the first time I heard you speak a million years ago, and that has stuck in my head since that day, because it couldn't be more right. You can learn everything in the world. If you don't take action, it's worthless. So maybe that's what you're about to say. So I hope I ruined that for you and you have to come up with something else. But the minute the listener logs off, what should they do?
To move all this forward?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say the very first thing they do, by the way, I love how Adrian worded it, is you got to know what the next step is, right? Like, what's the next great decision? What's the next great action? So if I'm listening to this, I say, hold on, where do we need more data? Where do we need measurement around the things that I think are important? What do I think are important that we're building this business around, that we're building the brand around? How do I make sure we have numbers or data attached to all of those categories? So instead of just my intuition, we can now start to measure, if it's worth doing, it's worth measuring. So if it's a priority, we should have a measurement attached to it. So I would sit down and say, what are the key strategic anchors? What are the key elements to our brand? And then what are the numbers that we have attached to these to see if this is actually working, resonating, or relevant to our consumer?
Love it. Great advice. Adrian, the minute people log off.
I'll break this down on how I typically, I guess, listen to these types of webinars, and what do I do immediately after is, for me, what I typically do is I take my notes and then I look at all those notes and what is the one piece of information of all these notes that I just wrote down, and what is the one that stood out the most to me. And then for me, it's okay, why did that one stand out the most? How does that relate? Very much so, like Luke said, how does that relate to what it is I'm working on right now? Whether that's sales, whether that's growing PT, whether that's growing your kids' program, whatever else it is. And then find out, and then I start digging a little bit more in that direction. That's because whatever that one piece for you, after you kind of list it out, there's probably a reason why it stood out, because it's top of mind. There's an issue going on there. And what decisions are you going to start making towards that? And then just following up what I said last, it's okay, from that piece of information, what is my step one? What is the first thing we need to do to move forward on this action now? Is it, do I need to get more data? Is it, okay, I just need to do something? Or is it something else entirely you haven't even thought of yet? So for me, that's the way I digest the data. I'll go back, re-review the list, what's item number one off of all those things, and how to move forward.
Awesome. Well, guys, I appreciate it. I couldn't think of two better people to wrap up the 4-part webinar series, Real versus Feel. The information you provided was phenomenal. And what I like is, it's not theory. It's what you're doing on a daily basis that you're sharing that has helped you guys achieve the high levels of success that you've achieved. So kudos to you. And I know how busy, Luke, you've got the corporate owned facilities, you're launching a bunch of franchises, you're all over the place. So I know how busy you are. Adrian, you're running one club and then you're opening a bunch of other clubs. So I know how busy you are as well. So please know how much I appreciate you taking this time, to be panelists on this webinar and providing such great information. You guys are incredible. I look forward to seeing you guys at Ursa in just a couple weeks in person without a rectangle around you and your name right here, and telling Luke, no, unmute. I can't hear, unmute, Luke. Can't hear you. But it's going to be great. So thank you again. I appreciate it. And big thanks to ASF for making this 4-part webinar series possible. We started talking about the truth about KPIs. Then we went into member feedback, then employee feedback, and then you two bringing it all home was just phenomenal. So thank you again, ASF, for caring about the industry and taking the extra steps to make sure they get top-notch education. So thank you again. If you enjoyed this, and I'm sure you did, please, it will be posted on YouTube so you can find it. If you have any questions, you can reach out to any of us. But thank you guys for being here. I know time is a commodity, and I'm grateful that y'all spent it with us. So go out there and keep changing lives. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.